Sony has announced that it will soon end the production of physical discs for PlayStation games.
Okay, so recently there's been a lot of buzz about physical games. Mainly, PlayStation and Xbox are moving more towards digital sales for games. And to be transparent, I personally don't care for physical games, but for me, the biggest issue is ownership and accessibility of the games. And I guess physical copies is in a way part of accessibility, but when I'm talking about accessibility, I'm mainly talking about live service games and them shutting down even though people have bought the game. So I'm all for offline modes in gaming. It should be the standard even for live service games. But throughout this video, you're gonna realize that the whole live service and keeping a game online is a whole different kind of worms. In the current era of gaming, we have games that range from 5 gigabytes to hundreds of gigabytes, like Call of Duty, which is almost 200 gigabytes? And this number seems to be growing each and every year. And because of this, companies don't use physical things like CDs or USBs anymore that could store the games. So they decided to have them as keys that allows people to have access to download the game from their preferred platform. But it wasn't always like this. At the beginning of gaming, someone could buy a game, get a physical copy, and once they have that physical copy, they would always have access to that game, even if the company shuts down or closes, showing that at one point, we had ownership of the games we bought, or at least I thought so. So, I wanted to take a look back on where it all began and how we ended up to the point where, technically, people who buy games don't actually own the games they bought. Okay, quick disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, nor do I claim to be one. Just a heads up. So, to understand how modern video game licenses work, we have to go all the way back to the origins of the first sale doctrine, which serves as the philosophical bedrock of physical media ownership. The doctrine originated in common law and was formally established in the United States by the 1908 Supreme Court case Bobbs-Merrill Co. v. Strauss. Bobbs-Merrill, a publisher, had printed a notice in a copyrighted book stating that the retail price was $1 and that any sale for less would be treated as an infringement of copyright. When the Macy's department store, owned by the Strauss family, sold the book for 89 cents, Bobbs-Merrill sued. The Supreme Court rejected the publisher's argument, ruling that the statutory rights to exclusively vend a work applied only to the initial sale. The court determined that adding the authority to control all future retail sales via a printed notice extended copyright protection beyond its legislative meaning. This ruling established that once a copyright owner sells a physical copy, their control over that specific copy is exhausted, allowing the purchaser to resell, lend, or give it away. This principle was subsequently reinforced in the Copyright Act of 1909. For decades, this doctrine heavily protected consumer rights, enabling the existence of used bookstores, libraries, and secondary markets. Okay, so we have an idea of how American laws view the sale of printed media, emphasis on printed media. While the first sale doctrine protected printed media, the newly growing software industry recognized it as a catastrophic financial vulnerability. In the early days of computing, software and hardware were bundled as a single product. IBM dominated the computing industry throughout the 1960s, distributing software in source form alongside its mainframe hardware. However, facing a prolonged antitrust lawsuit from the United States government initiated in 1969 regarding anti-competitive bundling practices, IBM was forced to unbundle its application software from its hardware. This separation presented a legal challenge. At the time, software was not officially recognized as a protectable subject matter under the United States copyright law, as it was considered intangible and unfixed. While an IBM task force believed copyright could eventually offer protection, they identified the doctrine of exhaustion as a critical threat. If software were sold, buyers would gain the legal right to resell or lend their copies, effectively destroying IBM's ability to control the secondary market. To work around this issue, IBM engineered a contractual mechanism. In 1969, the company introduced what is widely considered the first software licensing agreement. This physical document required a signature from the customer and was co-signed by IBM. The primary function of this contract was to establish a legal fiction that states the user was strictly a licensee of the software, categorically not an owner. By leasing the software rather than selling it, IBM successfully bypassed the first sale doctrine, setting a precedent that we currently experience in the video gaming industry. As the personal computer market expanded in the late 1970s and 1980s, with platforms like the Apple II, TRS-80, and Commodore 64, software was predominantly distributed on easily replicatable floppy disks and cassette tapes. Because early consumer hardware could easily duplicate this media, developers engineered physical analog copy protection schemes. These methods relied on the premise that while digital data was easy to copy, physical paper or plastic goods were difficult, tedious, or expensive to reproduce. Early disk level protections were also pioneered during this era. Microsoft Adventure, around the late 1970s, for the TRS-80 was one of the first major games released exclusively on disk, utilizing sector manipulation to prevent easy copying until it was cracked. And then, consoles come into play. If you're liking this video, please be sure to like and subscribe because it helps the channel out. Let's continue. Console manufacturers, on the other hand, wielded absolute control over their hardware ecosystems. Following the North American video game crash in 1983, which was caused by a flooded market of low-quality, unlicensed games, Nintendo designed the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES, to enforce strict quality control and block third-party developers from publishing without paying licensing fees. The core of this strategy was the Checking Integrated Circuit, CIC, commonly known as the 10NES system, patented in 1985. So pretty much, if the console chip detected a discrepancy or failed authentication, the SIC would reportedly assert a reset signal, causing the television and power LED to blink, causing the game to be unplayable. The 10NES chip fundamentally shifted the industry from physical copyright protection to integrated hardware DRM. It was highly controversial, leading to significant legal battles. Atari Games' subsidiary, Tengen, famously bypassed the 10NES by acquiring a copy of the lockout chip source code. Tengen used this code to reverse engineer their chip, allowing them to publish unlicensed NES games. A court later found that while copying code necessary to develop games for the NES, Tengen had violated copyright by copying extraneous portions of the 10NES code that allowed them to bypass the authentication process. So while hardware DRM successfully locked out unlicensed developers, the physical nature of cartridges meant that the second-hand sale market remained fiercely protected by the first sale doctrine. Which is a win, yay! But this tension between physical ownership and publisher control accumulated in the late 1980s. By 1989, Nintendo controlled an estimated 80% of the video game market, generating about 2.7 billion in software sales. All the while, video rental chains like Blockbuster Entertainment began renting out NES cartridges to capitalize on the industry's explosive growth. And because of the first sale doctrine, this rental practice was entirely legal, in the United States at least. Nintendo viewed the rental market as a direct threat to its primary sales, fearing that rentals fulfilled consumer demand without generating publisher revenue. The company decided to aggressively lobby alongside the Software Publishers Association in an attempt to replicate the success of the Japanese Copyright Amendments of 1984 and the American Rental Records Amendments Act, both of which had successfully banned commercial music rentals. A legislative compromise was brokered by the Video Game Dealers Association, resulting in the Computer Software Rental Amendments Act, prohibiting the rental of computer software, but explicitly excluded and allowed the rental of Nintendo video game cartridges. Left without a direct legislative remedy to hold game rentals, Nintendo pursued an indirect legal strategy. In 1989, Nintendo filed Nintendo of America Inc. versus Blockbuster Entertainment Corp. While they were unable to sue Blockbuster for renting the cartridges, Nintendo sued them for photocopying the copyrighted game instructions manual. The court affirmed that the rental of the video games was completely legal under the first sale doctrine, but ruled that the photocopying of the manuals was indeed an infringement of copyright. Blockbuster was forced to settle and agreed to stop reproducing the manuals. This time period showed the robust protections consumers held over physical media, which is great. And as the industry transitioned to higher capacity CD-ROMs and DVDs, the analog protections of the 1980s were replaced by aggressive, software-based DRMs. The 2000s marked a shift from merely preventing copying to deeply embedding publisher control into the user's operating system, often at the expense of consumer hardware integrity and security. In the early 2000s, publishers increasingly relied on third-party DRM middleware such as SecureROM, SafeDisk, and StarForce. These programs operated by installing hidden kernel-level drivers on the user's PC to authenticate the physical disk and prevent the execution of disk emulation software. However, the cost to consumers was extreme. Gamers reported widespread system instability, optical drive degradation, and operating system crashes, leading to a $5 million class action lawsuit against Ubisoft in 2006. The security vulnerabilities introduced by these DRMs were profound. In November 2007, a major security hole was discovered in SecureROM that allowed unrestricted kernel-level code access, potentially enabling hackers to remotely hijack a user's PC. Recognizing these structural threats, Microsoft took unprecedented action in 2015. With the release of Windows 10, Microsoft deliberately blocked the drivers required by SafeDisk and disabled SecureROM, stating that the deeply embedded DRM constituted a dangerous security loophole that could not be allowed. Is that low-key a Microsoft W? Well, consequently, hundreds of legally purchased physical PC games from 2003 to 2008 were rendered completely unplayable on modern operating systems without the use of cracks provided by software pirates, or by purchasing the DRM-free versions from storefronts like GOG. This event proved that physical ownership of a medium was meaningless if the software required to authenticate it was revoked. Simultaneously, with the escalation of PC DRM, console publishers sought to capture revenue from the thriving used game market. Because the first sale doctrine protected the resale of physical console discs, publishers could not legally stop secondary sales. Instead, they began stripping functionality out of the physical disc itself to de-incentivize used purchases, which we have now, where your disc is just a key that allows you access to download and play the game, making them more of a collectible and less useful when compared to just getting a digital copy of the game. In late 2009, Electronic Arts initiated Project $10, later standardized as the Online Pass. Under this system, new copies of games included a single-use serial code required to unlock multiplayer modes or major single-player DLCs. Early implementations included the Cerberus network in Mass Effect 2. Consumers who purchased a used copy of the game discovered that the online functionality was locked. To access it, they were forced to purchase a new digital pass directly from the publisher, typically for $10. EA's COO at the time noted that 60 to 70% of connected users were redeeming the codes, providing an entirely new revenue stream. The Online Pass was a transitional mechanism. It allowed publishers to extract a toll from the secondary market, effectively punishing consumers for exercising their rights under the first sale doctrine. Though EA ultimately discontinued the Online Pass in 2013, following severe consumer backlash, the program successfully conditioned the market for the ultimate goal: the complete eradication of physical media in favor of non-transferable digital distribution. So yeah, I guess it worked. Sometimes you just gotta take your L's for long-term W's. But the true death of video game ownership occurred in the courtroom. As the industry shifted from physical disc to digital downloads, publishers rewrote the legal parameters of consumer transactions. EULAs became the primary instrument of this change, explicitly stating that digital goods were licensed, not sold. The enforceability of these contracts resulted in complex, diverging legal doctrines between the United States and the European Union, though both ultimately sided with copyright holders. So pretty much, when you buy a game, you contractually don't own the game. You're licensing it. That's what the EULA is for. So we've all pretty much, like if you bought a game, you've pretty much agreed to these terms and conditions. However, there is a slight bright side. In response to the widespread consumer confusion over digital licenses, California's governor signed a bill that pretty much prohibits digital storefronts from using terms like buy or purchase when offering digital goods, unless the consumer is obtaining an unrestricted ownership interest. But I don't imagine that changed much of anything. Steam preemptively added checkout disclaimers, confirming that users are only purchasing a license. So the bill pretty much didn't change anything, it just changed how it was worded to consumers. The era of true video game ownership is functionally deceased and replaced entirely by an era of perpetual licensing. And high key, when you think about it, consumers never owned anything. Once it became software, it pretty much became inevitable that these companies would find a way to take away ownership rights from consumers. It was just only a matter of time. And at one point, there was a barrier. I don't know, it's kind of depressing to think about it. Like I said, the physical copy or the physical entity seemed to be a way for consumers to have control over ownership, but eventually when you have to download the game and the physical disk or drive that is used to access that content is only a key, pretty much the beginning of the end for consumers in terms of ownership. And now it's even worse because every game you played that requires online accessibility, you have to look at it with a side eye because that's the developer telling you that we can shut down this game and you don't have access to it no matter what. Maybe with the Stop Killing Games project, things would turn out much better, but it's a depressing thought. The problem lies in the fact that the people buying the games don't own the games, because technically we're licensing the games. So consumers don't have any control over the games. And I believe that's the root problem here. Since we're not owners of the product, we kind of don't have rights of what happens to the product legally. So realistically, it has to start from having ownership over the digital software we purchase. But that's my thought. What do you think? What are your views on how software is and how ownership works? How does this make you feel? Because it makes me feel sad. It's one of those things where I kind of wish I didn't know. I would have been way more happier if I just didn't know about this. Ignorance is bliss type of situation. But let me know what you think down in the comments. And please be sure to like and subscribe. See you in the next one.